guys, it's Reagan and welcome back to another video. And would you believe it, we are already over halfway through this year. I'm honestly still kind of processing all of that. Nonetheless, I am filming one of my favorite videos to film every single year, and that is the top 5 books I've read so far this year, as well as just a general look of all of the books I've read so far, which at this point is at 43 books, if I'm not mistaken. I'm currently tracking to beat my reading goal of 75 books, and in general, creating this top 5 list was a bit of a moving target because I have read so many incredible books this year that it's been really hard to narrow down. I'm honestly getting a little bit nervous about my top 10 books for the end of this year because there's still so many books left for me to read and encounter. There's just been so many home runs already, but without further ado, let's go ahead and dive into all of the books I've read so far this year, starting with the month of January. First up in January, I read The Girl Who Circumnavigated Fairyland in a Ship of Her Own Making by Catherine M. Valente. I gave this a 4 star. I also read A Sky Beyond the Storm by Saba Tahir, which I also gave 4 stars. Also caught up in a very beloved trilogy, the first book being Graceling by Kristen Cashore, which I gave 4.5 stars. Then I read Fire, which I gave 5 stars, and lastly Bitter Blue, which I gave 4 stars. I loved rereading this trilogy. I have a whole reading vlog documenting the process, but this absolutely held up. One of my all-time middle school favorites. Still incredible to this day. I read The Midnight Library, which I gave 3 stars. And then lastly, for the month of January, I read Gods of Jade and Shadow by Silvia Morano Garcia, which I gave 4 stars. Next up, we have the month of February, which I believe has been my best reading month of the year in terms of both page count and number of books finished, which is surprising given that it's the shortest month of the year. But the first novel I read was The Lesson by Cadwell Turnbull, which I gave 4 stars. And I completed Parable of the Sower by Octavia E. Butler, which I gave 5 stars. And I started my reread of The Stormlight Archives with The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson, 5 stars, obviously. I did read a bit of romance in the month of love with Take a Hint, Danny Brown by Talia Hibbert, which I gave 4.5 stars, as well as The Kiss Quotient by Helen Huang, which I gave 3.75 stars. Next up, I also read Pachinko by Min Jin Lee, which I gave 5 stars. And then I also read Remote Control by Nanedia Korafor, which I gave 4 stars. The Sound of Stars by Alicia Dow, which I gave 3 stars. And lastly, Raybearer by Jordan Ifweka, which I gave 4.5 stars. Next is the month of March, which was really just a bunch of long books, starting with The Sword of Kaigen by M.L. Wang, which I gave 5 stars. And then of course, Chain of Iron by Cassandra Clare, an absolute blast. I have a reading vlog documenting the entire process of reading this. I loved this. I really feel like it's a perfect YA angsty fantasy. I gave this 5 stars. Then I of course finished Words of Radiance by Brandon Sanderson, book 2 to the Stormlight Archive. Kaladin, In My Heart Forever, 5 stars. I love the second installment so much. Then I picked up Sunlin Ascends by Josiah Bancroft, which I gave 5 stars. Then I read The Office of Historical Corrections by Danielle Evans, which I gave 5 stars. And then lastly, I read Kings of the Wild by Nicholas Ames, which I gave 3 stars. Alrighty, now jumping into the month of April, I started out with The Fools Errand by Robin Hobb, which I of course gave 5 stars. Then I ran into a DNF with The Shadow of the Night by Deborah Harkness, which again, I didn't finish, so no star rating, but you could say I was a bit disappointed. Then I read A Loss Away by Darcy Little Badger, which I gave 3.5 stars. Then I read 2 very emotional hard hitters and vlogged it and cried on camera with Never Let Me Go by Kazu Ishiguro, which I gave 4.5 stars, and The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller, which I gave 4 stars. Then I read Arm of the Sphinx by Josiah Bancroft, which I gave 4.5 stars. Next was a very fun YA fantasy with The Shadow of the Fox by Julie Kagawa, which I gave 4 stars. And then lastly, I read The Ghost Bride by Yang-Shi Cho, which I also gave 4 stars. A lot of really strong books I read in the month of April. Lots of books I would highly recommend and just really enjoyed for this month. Next, moving on to the month of May, which was definitely full of a lot of highs and lows, at least for my reading, starting with To Sleep in a Sea of Stars by Christopher Paolini, which I gave 2 stars. Very boring. I also read Crown of Feathers by Nikki Powell Preto, which I gave 2.75 3 stars. Then I picked up a fantastic debut, The Ones We're Meant to Find by Joan He, which I gave 4.5 stars. I also read a riveting, fast-paced, incredible sci-fi novel, A Memory Called Empire by Arcady Martin, which I gave 5 stars. Next I read a very fun YA contemporary, I Believe in a Thing Called Love by Maureen Gu, which I gave 3.5 stars. Then I started my reread of a beloved beloved childhood favorite with The Golden Compass or The Northern Lights by Philip Pullman, and I gave this 5 stars. I loved this reread so much, and I can't wait to get to the rest of the series, hopefully before the end of this year. Then I also finally completed my reread of Oathbringer by Brandon Sanderson in the month of May. This took me a few months to complete, but I did love it. It was an emotional journey from beginning to end. 5 stars, Stormlight Archives, incredible stuff. To finish out the month of May, I also completed The Library of Legends by Janny Chang, which I gave 4 stars. Moving on to the month of June, which was my weakest reading month in terms of completed number of books, but I did really enjoy a lot of what I read, starting with The Memory Police by Yoko Ogawa, which I gave 4.5 stars. I also read The Master of Jin by P.J. Jelly Clark, which I gave 3.5 stars. Lost in the Neverwoods by Aidan Thomas, which was magical and lyrical and just has his incredible characters. I gave this 4 stars. Also completed Dawn Shard by Brandon Sanderson, which is a novella you're supposed to read between Oathbringer and Rhythm of War, which I did start Rhythm of War in the month of June, but did not complete it. And lastly, I have The Shadow of the Gods by John Gwen, which I gave 4.5. Maybe 5 stars. I'm still marinating on that, but I did really love this book. Alrighty guys, those are all of the books I've read within the first 6 months of the year, but let's chat about the top 5 books I've read. Again, quite the moving target. This was so hard to narrow down. I've just read so many books I love this year so far. But I have my pile here, and I'm gonna start off this list with The Fools Errand by Robin Hobb, the first book to the Tawny Man series. I'm also currently in the midst of reading book 2 within this trilogy. With that read, I have fallen even more in love with Robin Hobb and her writing. It is no secret that I'm a big fan of Robin Hobb's characters and worlds. I find them to be very intricate, incredibly emotional. I find the builds to be slow, but so satisfying. And just the journey you go on throughout her series just has such incredible emotional payoff. In The Fool's Errand, we find herself on another journey with Fitz and the Fool. And while a lot of time has passed, a lot of the emotional scars as well as political consequences of that first series are still very much present within this book. Follow Fitz as he kind of moves from his self-induced isolation to kind of being involved within Farseer politics once again. Particularly within this kingdom, there are 2 types of magic. The first is called the Skill, which is a very rare form of magic mostly found within the royal family. It's kind of like mind control, mind communication type of magic. But there's also something called the Wit, which is much more widespread, but it's also really feared by society at large, and anyone who's kind of deemed to be a wit user can be ostracized or even executed. And the fear and tension against wit users is kind of on the rise in the beginning of this series, particularly because there is this political group called the Piebalds who are kind of inciting more fear and violence. In book 1, you follow Fitz as he's kind of reintroducing us to his life and his world, as well as the Fool, as they're kind of going on a specific quest to save a specific person. Throughout the rest of the series, the politics begin to evolve and also become more far-reaching, which I personally found to be very exciting, obviously, as we kind of see characters and places and political references, some of the other characters in series within Robin Hobb's world. I love this book so much. As I say over and over again, Robin Hobb really gives her characters the space to actually actively explore a lot of the trauma and the emotional consequences of being a chosen one figure within a fantasy story. You can't help but fall in love with everyone and feel so much pain and suffering while reading this series. I just love it so much. I'm such a big fan. I hope to finish the entire trilogy before the end of the year, but so far the first book and most of the second book, which I've read at this point, have been excellent. Next up, I also want to shout out the Sunlin Ascend series by Josiah Bancroft. This is a series that definitely took me by surprise, but just has so many elements that I love so much. I just truly look forward to picking up anything by this author, the rest of the books within this series. I love the writing and the characters and the ambiance. It's just so original and engaging. But if for some reason you haven't heard me talk about this book series, it essentially follows our main character Sunlin. And at the beginning of the story, he and his wife have traveled to this giant tower called the Tower of Babel. This place is full of thousands upon thousands of people. It's constructed of many different floors, and in general, it's kind of a place of grand mystery and whimsy and adventure. Sunlin has always dreamed of visiting and exploring this tower, and he finally does on his honeymoon with his wife. Unfortunately, right when they arrive, they get separated. And so begins Sunlin's journey of trying to find and get reunited with his wife. And through the first 2 books, which I have read so far, you basically follow him as he traverses many different floors within this tower, come across so many different types of people, conniving and helpful. This book really escalates and evolves in ways that I personally did not anticipate. It's emotional, the characters really stick with you, it's incredibly imaginative, it kind of has the whimsy of a middle grade with a lot of darkness that comes with adult fantasy. I could not put this book down. The first one especially was absolutely heart-racing because you couldn't really figure out what in the world was going on or who even to trust, as well as just trying to discover what is going on behind the scenes in all of these different floors was truly fascinating. I loved this first book, I loved the second book, such a great series. I can't wait to finish it again, hopefully before the end of this year, but one of my favorite pickups for sure. Next up is a standalone favorite, and that is The Sword of Kaigen by M.L. Wang. This book, the amount of stuff the author is able to pack into one novel is just astounding. Obviously, this book is not short by any means, but the character development, the political landscape, the combat, the emotional weight present within the story is just absolutely wild. And I think about the characters in this story often. They live within me for the rest of time, but this is really described to be for fans of the Poppy War as well as Avatar: The Last Airbender, and I definitely agree that that is an apt comparison. This has really dark and violent politics, as well as some really cool and intricate elemental magic that's very much explored within this story. Primarily, this is a dual perspective story, first following Mamaru, who is the oldest son within the Matsuda family. He's 14 years old and has dedicated his life to basically training to be able to seize his family's power as well as protect his family and his homeland. He lives within the Kusanagi Peninsula, which is on the tail end of the Kaigenese Empire, and they're essentially considered the Sword of Kaigen, a place where the strongest warriors live. However, his life is kind of turned upside down when he meets a new student at his school who kind of opens his eyes to the outside world and kind of makes him realize that a lot of what he knows might in fact not be true and instead be government propaganda, and he begins to question everything around him, which also brings him much closer to his mother, which is the second main perspective we follow. Mizaki has told herself that she has left the passions of her youth behind and is instead settled into her new role of raising her family. But when Mamaru comes to her with lots of questions, both about the Kaigenese Empire itself, but also previous conflicts and other colonial powers kind of vying for power within the region, it brings these two characters closer together. And from there, escalation and war break out. This book is just so good. Again, the elemental magic as well as the combat is thoroughly plotted out, so well written and incredibly intense. But I just really loved the sort of political journey that the author takes us on. Through Mamaru's perspective, we really get to see sort of the earth-shattering reality of when he begins to kind of learn the truth. Also him fighting to figure out what his new purpose is, but also wanting to still protect his family. And through Mizaki's chapters, who has become one of my favorite perspectives, characters in fantasy of all time, we follow a mother who will do anything to protect and help her family, but also uncover and begin to learn more about her past, as well as just a deep and painful exploration of motherhood and everything that has kind of come throughout her life. This book is so good. I don't know how many different ways I need to say it. Amazing, incredible, emotional, one of my favorite books for sure. I want more by this author. Amazing, a fantasy standalone. And then the last two books I have already mentioned in my mid-year freak out book tag, so I'll keep it brief, but the first one is Pachinko by Min-Jin Lee. I've loved this book. I've since made Clay read this book. He loved this book. This is just a historical fiction story that will just take your breath away. It's heartbreaking, it's beautiful, it's just a story of perseverance and just life. But essentially, this is a multi-generational historical fiction story following one immigrant family as they move from Korea and ultimately establish themselves in Japan. We initially start this tale with Sunja and her story, but again, the story kind of breaks out into multitudes of different threads, kind of touching on everyone, both within the family, but also even connected with the family. This is a profoundly moving historical fiction tale full of love, passion, and sacrifice. And again, this really spans quite a significant amount of time, but through the different chapters, you really feel rooted within this family's life and their struggle to just be, and it's just amazing, to be honest. And I truly implore you to pick this up if you haven't already. It's just stunning and moving, and there is going to be an adaptation of this, I want to say coming out pretty soon on Apple TV, so that hopefully can motivate you a bit more, but I loved this book. I also feel like it shined a light on a piece of history that I personally did not know a lot about as well, but yes, this book was absolutely incredible. one of my favorite books I have ever read. Honestly. The final book within my top 5 list will be The Parable of the Sower by Octavia E. Butler. This book is honestly haunting for a variety of reasons, but mostly because it feels so possible. This is a near future dystopian story that feels so real that it just adds this element of anxiety that you'll just feel while reading it, but it was also just incredible. But this novel is set in the 2020s, post a climate and economic crisis that has kind of brought the end to society as we know it. The book itself opens in California, and with pervasive water shortages, as well as roaming groups of vagabonds who will do anything to survive another day, most people have kind of retreated into insular, guarded communities, which is where we find our main character Lauren, who lives in a gated community with her family as well as a bunch of other families kind of all working together to survive. Her father is also a really integral part of the community as he is also a pastor. But in a world where any vulnerability can be seen as a risk, Lauren has to hide with a secret as she suffers with something called hyperempathy, which is a dilapidating sensitivity to the pain and emotions of everyone around her. At the beginning of the story, Lauren kind of senses a change, or rather opens her eyes to a risk, and she is trying to convince her community that they need to alter their way of life to basically evolve to be able to protect themselves and their community in the future. Unfortunately though, her cries are not heard, which kind of eventually leads her to go on a personal and spiritual journey to try to find a new safe haven for herself. This is a story that just has so many layers. One, the dystopian near future American reality, again, just feels so real and so possible, especially if we continue to leave a lot of our societal issues to fester. So much of this book is also a personal, physical, as well as spiritual journey of our main character Lauren. The story itself is kind of structurally told almost like diary entries. So not only do we get kind of day-to-day snapshots of her life, but we also see her kind of working through a new idea and a new religion that better speaks to the current reality of the world in which everyone is living and trying to survive in. And this spiritual aspect of the book definitely provides a bit of light as well as hope kind of within the darkness that sort of surrounds everything else that is going on. I really loved this story so much. It was shocking, it was brutal, it was terrifying, but it was also, again, uplifting, and just watching Lauren go on this journey was incredible. Structurally, I really enjoyed how it was written a lot. While this book absolutely terrified me from beginning to end, I also really loved it as well, and obviously gave it 5 stars, and for sure one of my favorite books I've read this year. Alrighty guys, that is every book I've read so far in 2021, plus my top 5 favorite books of the year so far. Let me know down below some of your current faves, as I would love to know, and I will see you soon with another video soon. Goodbye!